Welcome back. In this lecture, we are going to look at two very important aspects of any work of art. The first of these is the focal point. This is the main focus of the work. It's where your eye will almost automatically land first and return to it on a regular basis. This is something planned by the artist. The second of these is point of view, and that's how you are looking at representational art, by which I mean that the work you're looking at is not abstract and it is a representation of something. Now, point of view is how you are posited, again by the artist. If it is a scene with figures, where are you with this point of view? Are you above or below or kind of head-on looking at them, for example? Knowing about point of view and focal points makes it possible to know exactly where you are as a viewer in the composition. And that in turn lets you understand and really appreciate how you are approaching the scene and why you'll have different experiences depending on the carefully oriented point of view or focal points. So let's start with point of view. Now, in traditional painting, with the Renaissance-based belief of art as imitation of nature, the idea is that you see this scene and you're kind of entering it. The point of view strongly affects how you enter and how you process that scene. And I like to think about this a little bit like a theater. When you go to a theater and you have that traditional frame of a proscenium arch, and that's how you enter the drama or whatever it is you're looking at in the theater. Now, lots of artists address this very overtly self-conscious reference to how their art works. So let's start by looking at this work. This is a work by Rembrandt. It's called The Holy Family, and it dates from 1646. And this, as we look at it, provides the usual illusion within the frame. And like a theater, it's a traditional point of view for the viewer. And he makes this very point by having that drapery go over it like a curtain, so we look at this framed work as if we are looking at it through the curtain and we're in the theater. Now, my point is, if we're looking at a scene with that kind of theater backdrop, then our point of view is really that we're just sitting back and watching the drama unfold. So it's a rather passive entering of the scene. We don't really enter it at all, we just view it. But now look at different points of view. This is a work by Theodore Robinson. He's an American impressionist. And the title of the work gives away what your point of view is, because you can see we're way up high, looking down on this landscape, looking down on this town. And the title is Bird's Eye View of Giverny. It's from 1889. And that's exactly what we term that very high point of view. It's called bird's eye view. We will hear later about a very low point of view, and of course that is the worm's eye view. For this lecture, think about point of view and entry for a holy scene. I've chosen some examples that are lots of images of Christian divinity from the Renaissance through the 20th century. And I think this might give us something to focus on, because as holy images, we really think twice about how we're approaching these. So let's start out with this work. This is by Raphael, an Italian Renaissance artist. It's the Sistine Madonna, and it dates from 1513. Now, who we have in here is not only the Madonna and Child, but also Pope Sixtus II, Saint Sixtus, and Saint Barbara. And the two of them were included as part of the original commission from Benedictine monks. Now, when we look at this again, we see the same kind of conceit, because he gives us the curtains on either side, drawn so we can see this, and he's got a shelf down below. And so this is the same kind of idea that we're seeing this as a vision, as if we're in a theater. He makes it very whimsical with those angels, who have been reproduced numerous times. And actually, they're part of the balance of the composition. And on one hand, we're treated to a vision of heaven behind the curtains, but the cherubs kind of link us to earth. The other notable object there is the mitre on the left-hand side of the shelf, and that is the Pope's ceremonial hat. Now, the Pope becomes kind of the mediator, God's servant on earth. So he's kind of making the vision possible. For people in organized religion, especially at the time this was painted, that would have been a very clear role for the Pope, and so it's a very comfortable way of handling this for the viewer. The fact that the viewer would be seated as if being presented by this very staged vision would have been very comfortable for them at the time. So let's compare that to another work. This is by Gerrit van Honthorst, a Dutch artist. It's called Adoration of the Shepherds, and it dates from 1622. Now, especially compared to the scene that we just saw, doesn't this particular view seem very, very intimate? So let's look at why this is. First of all, it has a cropped composition, and that certainly adds to this intimacy. And by cropped, I mean that there's nothing completely within the composition as we had it with the Sistine Madonna. Instead, we have figures that are on the outsides of the composition, and we only see part of them, which means that the ends of them are not even in our peripheral vision. So unlike the Sistine Madonna, here it's as if you are on stage and very familiar. Now, St. Joseph has his hand very casually on the head of the ox, so you believe that you're really there. People are doing very normal things considering that there's a new baby. And also they're thoroughly natural and down to earth. This includes the faces, including the Madonna, who can be seen as a kind of common woman. There's no halos. The only light, in fact, shining is coming from the baby, and that's the only thing that reminds you of the divine presence. So all of this suits our point of view. The point of view here is an important augmentation to this view. So what is it? Well, our point of view here is very close and head-on. And if you think about who you're across from, you're right across from Mary. You look like you could just look right into her face. Well, what does that mean? Your point of view, you must be kneeling to also have this particular point of view. So you're one of the shepherds, and you get this privileged presence at the birth of Christ. Now let's look at another. This is a work by Titian, Italian artist. It's Madonna of the Pesaro family. This dates from 1519 to 1526. Now I should tell you right away, all the figures in this painting are life-size. And our point of view is right there with the males of the Pesaro family on the right. And it's intensified by the young boy who turns and looks directly back, making eye contact with us. And this establishes a real clear point of view so that we know we're supposed to join the family and in turn look up in admiration to the Madonna. Now that whole idea of having somebody look out of the composition at you is a fairly common practice, as we'll see. And I like to think it's almost like a Shakespearean actor who at one point breaks out of character, goes standing to the side of the stage and gives these asides, kind of saying, well, you do realize what's going on here. And that's exactly what we get from this boy. He's giving us a kind of visual aside saying, I know you're there looking at me and I'm looking at you, so come and join us. Now let's look at another work. This is by Emil Nolde, a German artist, 20th century, and this is termed The Pentecost. It's from 1909. And here you realize right away there's no comfort zone at all. And he uses very garish colors, but it's especially this ultra cropped composition and point of view that leads us to think, where are we and why are we kind of backing up from this particular composition? Well, it's very cropped, it's very closed in, but this is the Pentecost, a very spiritual, emotional moment for all of the disciples, and Nolde actually leaves a space at the table for us. So that's point of view. Now what about focal points? Let's take a little bit of time to look at those. This is Raphael again, Madonna of the Meadow. It's from 1505. And remember, the focal point is where you look first and usually end up. It is planned by the artist as a main visual point of the work. And here you have the Madonna with two children, one the Christ child and one St. John the Baptist. and the boys are looking at each other as they play with the cross. The focal point is actually just about where St. John the Baptist, the boy on the left, holds that cross. But actually, and this happens a lot, the focal point would really be that whole space between the two children who are looking at each other. And in this particular kind of depiction, that relationship is most important. Some believe that St. John the Baptist was Christ's cousin. All believe that he came ahead of him to make way for the arrival of Christ. So Christ's hand holding the top of the cross makes the cross actually work like a pointer up to the last important point, which is the Madonna's face. Now that was, I think, a pretty easy one for us to see the focal point. I wanted to give us one that's more of a challenge. This is Bruegel the Elder. He's a Flemish artist, and this is the Battle of Carnival and Lent. It dates from 1559. Now, at first, when you look at this very busy scene, you might think there is no focal point because everything seems to be going on and everything seems to be getting the same amount of attention. But spend some time and look at it. There actually is, I think, a small one in the center of the composition. There's a little swath of lighter color right in the center, and you see two simple figures. They're not overly active. They're not brightly or differently colored. The woman has a white scarf, but otherwise they're just in brown tones like the rest of the figures. But now notice a couple of things. They are slightly larger, just slightly, than the others at their level of depth in the composition. And this makes it part of the focal point. If you're not really looking at those details, you'd never think that they're slightly larger than they should be. But when you start really looking, you realize that that's one of the things that can draw your attention. And also, they're seen from the back. Now, we learned in the very first lecture what that does for our point of view, because like Mark's horse in the landscape, we see figures from the back, and that gives us a place. We are supposed to take their place so that we are now right in the middle of this very busy composition. Now, the whole composition I mentioned is like chock-a-block with different figures, activities, stories, all with great meaning to viewers at the time. There's a lot of these figures are acting out morals, for example. So the painter lets you traverse at a fairly slow pace all through the composition. There's an awful lot going on, but he tries to slow down. You're looking at all this. And it could get overwhelming, but he's saved a resting place for your eyes. It's very unassuming, but it ends up being comfortable. It ends up helping us to take in this whole huge work. So point of view and focal points work together. They predetermine the viewer's approach to a painting, whether it's passive or active, whether it's fast or slow eye movement. Now, you do have some works that are deliberately without any focal point. There's no focal point at all. What I'm going to show you is a work from abstract expressionist movement, and those artists themselves tended to call their paintings overall paintings, which means that they really didn't have any distinction in one part or another. This is a work by Jackson Pollock, an American artist, and this is Convergence from 1952. And when you look at this as a whole, you realize there really is no area with different or darker or lighter colors. There really isn't a focal point. And that actually matched the manner of painting, because Pollock was known for dripping his paint onto canvases that he had spread out and rolled on the floor. And so as he works over the whole canvas, just dripping, you can imagine that he made sure that he gave an equal amount of attention to one side of the canvas and another. And actually, works deliberately made with no focal point at all do that deliberately. And they want to make sure that you feel that you are not at a certain point approaching this scene, but rather that you are totally in the painting. And Pollock actually spoke about when he was doing the work, he wanted to be in the painting. So if we look at this work, this is a work by Rothko, a Russian-born American. It's number 10 from 1952. And as you approach the work, as this viewer might, you go up to it and you'll see a sense of scale there. It's so big, and it kind of envelops the viewer. And that's what's intended. When we look at the work just by itself, without that viewer there, and we imagine that we're the viewer looking at it up close, it becomes actually something that, because there is no focal point, you just get mesmerized by all of this color spreading out and around you. And that's the way that both Pollock and Rothko wanted us to approach the work. It becomes more than just a looking exercise. It's more of a visually triggered whole experience. Now, we also have to look at focal points and point of view in sculpture. Now, framed sculpture, which we're going to learn what's called relief, is sculpture that only can be seen from one point of view. Although it has a back and it has mass, parts actually stick out of it and engage space. It uses a type of composition and focal point much as does painting, because it is a single point of view that we get. Now, three-dimensional sculpture, and we use the term in the round, will have multiple types of compositions and focal points, depending on which side of the work is being viewed. The point of view in relief sculpture can be part of the representation as in painting. But both relief and in the round sculpture can also have a point of view that is actual, because it is someplace where you have to physically approach it. So we're going to look at this. It's possible that you could have a point of view of the sculpture itself if you were looking at it head on, but you have another point of view of the sculpture's way up here or way down there, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's start with relief sculpture, which has point of view and focal points. This is a work by Ghiberti. It's the Florence Cathedral doors, often called the Gates of Paradise. The date of this is 1425 to 1452. And what you can see there is that you have these two doors, and each one has 5 main panels on it. We're going to be looking at the panel in kind of the central left panel, and that is titled Jacob and Esau. Now here we're looking just at the panel. And as we're seeing it here, we've got a direct head-on view of the figures in the panel. You can look up, because you're at their stage, you look up and you see the top or the bottoms of the arches in the background. And notice one thing. The foreground boy has his foot, which is tipped up, and it looks almost as if we're seeing the bottom of his sole. That would be a good example of worm's eye view. Now take a look at how we would actually see this sculpture in 3 dimensions. If you're looking at it, and say, I think we've got regular height people here, and as they're looking at it, they actually are looking up at it. So in other words, they're not looking straight on, they're looking up at it. So you would get a perfect worm's eye view of that heel of the foot going up. Now for fully 3D sculpture, I need to remind you, as we saw already, a lot of sculpture has pedestals and bases, and that can change your point of view as well, just as here, you can't possibly see the top panels of that door from head on. So let's look at another example. This is Donatello, an Italian Renaissance artist again, and this is his David. It's 1425 to 1430. And here it is, as you can see at the bottom of these images. It not only has a little base, but it's also on a pedestal. So we look up to that figure. So that's one view of the figure. But then furthermore, each view of the sculpture will have a focal point, but your point of view looking up will not change. That part's consistent. When we look at the focal points, in 3-dimensional sculpture, those focal points exist for various views as the viewer walks around the work. And usually these are designed to control eye movement and further walking, to lead the viewer physically around the sculpture to see all of it. In other words, one focal point can kind of lead to the next. And Donatello was a master of this. If you look at the sculpture from the front, the focal point is really 2 different ones, the head of David and also the head of Goliath, which sits below his foot. And we end up looking at Goliath And you're fascinated by this decapitated head, so you kind of have to walk around the sculpture to see what else is going on with that head. Then when you go around, you're looking at David from the side. And here you don't even see that one focal point anymore. You see the head of David in profile. And so much more fascinating is his hand holding the sword right in the middle of the composition. So now you've moved on to another focal point. But that in turn should lead your eye and move your feet so that you're looking at the sword itself. And that will draw you around to both the front and the back so that you can see another point of view and another focal point. So that's how a really great sculptor plans these sculptures in the round that get you to walk around looking for different things, and he's the one who actually leads you. Now, there are some sculpture that, again, have no single focal point. This is the work of Eva Hesse. She's a German-born American artist. The title is Repetition 19, number 3. It's from 1968. And a lot of modern sculpture is like this. It doesn't have a focal point, but rather works like an installation that the viewer has to walk around and sometimes even through. And for that purpose, the idea is that you are much more in control of how you're approaching that sculpture. And that means that, like those abstract paintings, they'd want you to get involved in the sculpture, involved in the installation, so they don't want to give you a focal point that might take your attention away from that. Now, kinetic sculpture, which is motorized, does kind of put all the control back with the artist. This is the work of Jean Tinguely, a Swiss artist. He did a whole series called Metamechanicals, and this is his Metamechanical automobile sculpture from 1954. It's made of a little bit of everything. You have iron, wire, painted sheet metal, and of course the all-important winding mechanism. Because these machines are controlled by a push button. Sometimes they're on the wall next to the installation, and sometimes they're on the floor. Always look for that because it's an awful lot of fun. As soon as you push the button, the sculpture itself springs into kind of wild gyrations, and it emits usually a lot of noise. It's meant to be a satire of classical sculpture that was praised for having its noble simplicity and calm grandeur. So this kind of sculpture is a real raucous sculpture for the 20th century city. And again, we have other works that move, and depending on how they work, they either take more control away from you or less. This is a work by Alexander Calder, an American artist. It's called La Spirale, and this is a stable. It's from 1958. Now, most of us know the work of Calder, and we know that he was known for building mobiles. And the mobiles are the same kind of construction, but they hang from a ceiling. They're suspended. And it's the wind that moves them. So in this case, though, the stables, he provides a base for it and then has the same kind of construction mounted on the top. Now, in this case, you get multiple focal points, obviously, but it's even more controlled because it turns, not you. You can walk around these things, but while you're walking around, my point is, they could be moving faster or less fast than you are. So it's also not controlled constantly by the artist, but definitely there's some control taken away from the viewer. Now let's look at one more work, because there's also some very interesting earthworks that were made in the late 20th century that also have unique approaches to point of view or focal points. This is a work by Nancy Holt. She's an American artist. It's called Sun Tunnels, and this is located in the Great Basin Desert of Utah. These were constructed between 1973 and 76, and all that they are very carefully placed, as we'll see, concrete, like giant tubes. And they're set up to capture the sunrise and sunset. Now, in order to have this experience, we, again, are having this experience in a reproduction. But in order to have that, you really have to be dedicated, because you'd have to pay to go to some of these national parks where a lot of the earthworks occur. But if you were lucky enough to do that, and you were standing right at this spot, then as the sun rose, they're set up that they kind of capture that sunrise and have it swirl and come straight out to you. It's kind of a turned around focal point. You're not finding the focal point is going to find you. Now let's return one more time to another point using that same Titian, the Madonna of the Pesaro family that we saw. And I wanted to show it to you here with a whole installation, including the altar. And speaking of photographs, remember what we learned about the difference of viewing art in reproduction. The point of view, the experience that we talked about already, seeing that one boy look out at us, taking our place there, that's based on how it would have been photographed for us. And the camera in this case would have been, you can see from where the altar is, it would have been head on to the painting. But if we're actually, again, lucky enough to be there, we realize now that we would be standing way below that painting. So there's a difference in how we see things in reproduction in terms of point of view and how we might see the actual work later on if we're lucky enough to meet them, as I say, in person. So let's end with one comparison, and I want you to try this out. I chose deliberately two works that are very, very similar so that we can see what point of view and focal points can do. This on the left is Edouard Manet. He's a French artist and a French impressionist, in fact. This work is Boating from 1874. And on the right, we have a work by Auguste Renoir, a French artist also a French impressionist. And this is called Women in a Boat. This is from 1877. Now, if we look first at the focal point on the left, it's not really that strong. I think it's actually the woman's face, and you have dark lines of the boat, the edge of the boat, that kind of curl around both ways to get you there. Now, what's the point of view? You'd be right if you thought you're above it. It's not bird's eye view, you're not way above it, but you are above it, which means you're probably not in the boat. You might be on the side of the lake where they're passing by. You might actually be on a dock. That's my idea. But it plays up the artificiality of this particular scene because, again, it puts us out of that space as if we're in a theater and we're watching these as actors gliding by. Now, let's look at the Renoir. This is a very obvious focal point. And if you look at it twice, you'll realize it's very hard to look at that work and not focus in on the woman's face. It's just really difficult. She's in a darker outfit. She's closer to the center of the composition. She's looking out at us. And so this is very engaging, and that would be the focal point. But where are we? What's the point of view? And we realize that we're looking head on to her, and there's no way that we could actually see her knees the way we see them unless we're in the boat. So it changes the whole idea of how we confront the figures in the scene. Our point of view here is from up close and personal. We're in the boat. Tools for this lecture. Notice your relationship to the scene. That would be point of view. Do you seem to be seeing the work from above, below, or straight on? Are you an outside observer looking in on a very self-contained scene? That would make you rather passive. Does someone or something inside the picture invite you to come into the work? Does the work actively confront you with cropping, compacting, or a close-up point of view? Notice what parts of the work your eye is drawn to, and that would be the focal point. What kind of catches your eye when you look first at a work of art? How does your gaze move around the work as you explore it? And where does your gaze finally come to rest? Is this the kind of work that doesn't have a focal point or that has more than one? If it's a three-dimensional work, be sure to walk around it. So ask yourself, how do the point of view and the focal point in this particular work contribute to my approach to it and therefore to its meaning? Now, the next lecture, we'll be moving on to look at more conventional aspects of the work of art. And by that I mean that what we've talked about in this lecture, that point of view especially, is not usually considered an important aspect of the work of art. So next time we'll be moving on and looking at color.